Chapter 11 of the Dalehouse Murder by Francis Everton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. The Dalehouse Murder. Chapter 11. On the landing at midnight. With quiet, stealthy tread on the heavy carpet, I attained a position halfway up the flight of stairs. Not a sound had I made, not a board had creaked. No movement or noise was anywhere in all the quiet house. Then, with a quick catch in my breath, I halted, suddenly motionless, my fears redoubled. There, just above me, stuck up above the switch, and shining white in the light from the landing, was a square piece of paper similar to the one I had found in the same position only the night before I came upstairs to bed. I fancied that somehow or other my own stealthy movements had engendered in me a condition keyed up and ready tuned to vibrate in response to any sudden nervous shock, for uncontrolled my heart went pounding and a sickening chill went shuddering down my back. To steady myself again, I had to grasp the handrail. Last night, just such another piece of paper to which I had made my unfortunate and imbecile addition, but Stella dead when the morning came. No possible connection between the two. How could there be when, innocent, I myself had committed the more pertinent part of the folly? And now again, tonight, another piece of paper standing out clear and white against the landing wall. What did it all mean? What could it mean? Was some fresh disaster lying hidden undiscovered just ahead? Or was it nothing but another stupid joke? But in God's name, I asked myself, who, either sane or sober, would perpetrate such a joke, or any joke, so soon after Stella's death and the day's events? And if not a joke, then? Full of apprehension, I mounted the remaining stairs. It was a plain postcard I found, with the address Dalehouse, Manchester, printed neatly in the top right-hand corner. I had observed similar cards standing in a case on the top of the doctor's desk. Across the middle of it had been pasted the words, "Dark deeds are done in Dalehouse at night." Just for a brief moment, I did not quite grasp the reason for the irregular appearance of the message, but I soon tumbled to it that the sentence had been built up by cutting out odd words and letters from a newspaper and then pasting them onto the card. A faint pencil line had been ruled to keep the wording level. A neat and careful hand had been at work. I suppose that in even the most sheltered and uneventful lives there are some little scenes that for one reason or another stand out with illogical precision from among the million of tiny impressions that are daily transferred from retina to brain. Childish memories, perhaps, that stand out clear and unfaded by the passage of time, while the settings of life's most important crises become fogged and indeterminate. For me, however, there will always remain an unfaded mental picture of that quiet, dimly lighted landing, the tracery of the pattern on the carpet, the shadow of the handrail on the stairs, the highlights and shadows on the metal of the double switch, and the plain white card with its ominous little message. I have but to close my eyes to recall each minute detail at will, and see myself standing hesitant at the center of the picture, miserable and incapable of action. Since breakfast time, a century ago it seemed, each long hot hour had been fraught with some fresh horror or distress, and now, fagged out, my brain refused to work, my faculties failed to function. I gazed at the card in stupid amazement. I felt my eyes grow round and goggle. What should I do? What ought I to do? Should I obey my first impulse and arouse the decisive doctor, in spite of the fact that a space of minutes only had passed since I had labelled him the logical answer to a riddle in the dark? Should I knock up Kenneth and Ralph and precipitate yet another repetition of the earlier angry scenes? Should I ring up the police? Or should I allow myself to drift, come to no decision at all, go to bed, and lock my door? Each alternative in turn I pondered out 20 times and then rejected. To go calmly to bed, leaving the others ignorant and unwarned of such an open threat against their safety, was unthinkable indeed. Yet, try as I might make up my mind, I could not to any other course of action. There I stood, yes, and might have stood till dawn of day, turning the wretched card ever over and over in my hand, hot with self-shame and fuming at my incapacity. Then I heard a gentle muffled sound of movement on the landing up above, and brought me back to life once more and quickened me to action. I pushed up the switch as gently as I might, and stood in the dark, alert at last and listening. Yes, someone was moving cautiously about, faint but unmistakable. Testing each board as I trod it against a sudden creak, step by step, soft and slow, I crept along the stairs that led to the upper landing and poor murdered Stella's bedroom. The door of the fatal room was standing wide, and as my eyes reached the level of the topmost step, they met a beam of white electric light. Low and level, it made a track of light that cut the darkened room in two, and crouching down against it, there was somebody kneeling. It was the Tundish. I recognized him at once in spite of the dim light. The big white tassels at the end of his dressing gown cord and those thin but steady hands of his gave him away. I negotiated the remaining steps and gained the head of the flight without a sound, unless my thudding heart was really audible. Then I stood absorbed. To his right on the floor there lay a small electric torch. That was the light I had seen as I mounted the stairs. In the narrow path that it slashed across the shadows, the doctor's sensitive hands were moving methodically over the carpet. He was stroking the pile this way and that, his white taper fingers ever probing and searching. Then he pushed the light a pace farther on and repeated the process. I watched as he moved his position half a dozen times or so. Then from the landing below there came the unmistakable distinctive click of a closing door. The Tundish heard it too. I saw him jerk up his head to listen. His hands ceased their restless searching and lay quiet and still in the band of light. What would he do, I wondered, if he thought that there was someone awake and moving about on the landing beneath? What would he do if he knew that I stood there in the dark just behind him watching him at work? He switched off the electric torch. I flattened myself against the wall. "What is it, Jeffcock?" he whispered. "Did you hear a door shut down below?" I jumped like a frightened horse. So sudden and unexpected came the whispered question from out of the quiet, darkened room. Not once had he turned his head or glanced in my direction. The landing was inky black. I could have sworn that I had not made a vestige of noise as I crept up the stairs to find him. Yet not only did he know that he was being watched, but he knew that it was I. Had we both been seated comfortably at the breakfast table, he might have questioned me as to a second helping of bacon in just such a casual tone of voice. Astonishing and imperturbable, could nothing shake him? Did he see nothing incongruous or bizarre in my standing there on the darkened landing at dead of night while he made his secret search on the floor by Stella's bed? "What on earth are you doing? And how did you know I was there?" I asked in a shaking voice that I failed to control. "Shh! Speak more quietly, man. Did you think you heard a door shut? Come along in and close the door." Since I've often thought, and I must confess with not a little shame, that there could have been no better illustration of a strong man's personality dominating of a man less strong. There was I, with my suspicions all aroused, suspicion backed by evidence and based on solid reasoning, suspicions which, in spite of my instinctive liking for the doctor, would not lie dormant and disregarded. Yet he only had to whisper, "Come along in and close the door," and I got to him in a darkened room without thought of harm or danger. One minute I write him down a murderer. The next, unhesitating, I place my life in his hands. I find him creeping furtively about the house at night with an electric torch, and it is he who quietly asks me what I am doing and what it is that I want. In the dark we stood with straining ears for a little time, and then he opened the door and listened again at the top of the stairs. I remained alone in the room, still troubled as to what line of action I ought to take. Should I show him what I had found, and tax him with having put it where I found it, or let matters run their course and see what happened next? I could just make out the outline of Stella's bed. Dark deeds are done in Dalehouse at night. I still held the card in my hand. He came back to me, shutting the door carefully behind him. He switched on his flashlight again, taking care to keep the beam directed away from the window in which the blind was undrawn. "What is it, Jeffcock? Is anything the matter? What made you come up here?" he whispered quickly. "I heard you moving about. What were you looking for?" He hesitated. "Look here, Jeffcock, I really am most awfully sorry, but I can't tell you. I was merely following up a little idea of my own, doing a little private detective work." I believed him implicitly and at once. So much for my labors in the drawing-room. I showed him the revised edition of the notice. So much for my voluminous notes and my absurd little table of final reckoning. "What do you think of that?" I asked, watching his face as closely as I could in the light of the electric torch. "Where did you find it?" I told him. He whistled softly. He held the light up close to the printed words. black shadows and a small bright circle of light. A strong white hand holding a small white card. As I looked, I felt my suspicions revive again. But directly he spoke, I was reassured. "I don't like it," he said after a pause. "I don't like the look of it at all. It means the devil of a disturbance and a fuss, but we must wake the others up and make sure that all of them are safe. This little message cannot be ignored. We will leave Annie and cook until the last. Come along downstairs." Side by side we made our way downstairs again, and only just behind us there came the quiet pad, pad, pad of another pair of feet. I put my hand on the doctor's arm to stay him, and we stood together holding our breath and straining to hear. Our follower also stopped immediately. He or she must be standing a little way above us on the darkened stairs. The tundish flashed on his torch and sent its white beam searching up and down. Not a soul was to be seen. All was empty and quiet and still. To say that I was badly scared would be an understatement. The unhealthy heat of the interminable day, the shock of the morning's discovery, the ordeal of little Alport's inquisition, Kenneth's violent outbursts, these and all the other events that had followed one another with such sinister regularity, each in turn had sapped my strength until now I stood a bundle of tortured nerves. I could have turned and fled. "Well, that beats the band," the tundish whispered. "You did hear a step?" "Yes, I could have sworn to it." He sent his light flashing to every corner again. Then, keeping it alight, he continued our interrupted descent. It came again at once, the gentle following tread of slippered feet. My hair fairly bristled. Then, to my astonishment, I heard the doctor chuckle. He twisted round and pointed his light at the steps immediately above him. "There's the ghost," he said, pointing to the tassels of the end of his dressing-gown cord, which was undone and dragging down the stairs behind him. He shook with silent mirth. "What a priceless pair of fools we are!" he gasped, but I had been too much upset to enjoy the humor of the situation. Arrived on the bottom landing again, he switched on the light. It was an old lamp retired from one of the rooms to do more humble service, and it gave but a dim and feeble light. It was very quiet. "Well, here's for it," he said. "You go and rout out Kenneth, and I'll attend to Ralph." I turned the handle of Kenneth's door and was not surprised to find it locked. Soon we both of us were knocking loudly with our fists. There was no longer need to be quiet, and the noise that we made went echoing like a challenge through the silent house. "Dark deeds are done in Dalehouse at night." I thumped it out on Kenneth's door. He was very sound asleep, and I heard the doctor talking to Ralph before I could wake him up. When at length he did unlock his door, I told him to slip on his dressing gown, and soon the four of us were gathered in a group under the landing light. The two boys were full of questions, but the tundish asked them to wait with what patience they could while he roused the girls and made sure that they both were safe. Ethel's door swung slowly open on its hinges even as he moved toward it, and clad in a pretty smoke-blue dressing gown, she stood in the doorway before us, swaying slightly, only half awake, a hand against each post to give herself support. She had switched on a bedroom light, and its brighter glow shone through her ruffled curly hair. Senses quickening gradually, seeing us grouped together, her sleepy, long-lashed eyes grew wide, and her poor bruised face and swollen lips blanched and twitched as awakening fears increased. She tried to speak, and failed. The tundish hurried toward her. "What it is?" "Oh, what is it, tundish dear?" she whispered. He reassured her with a quiet, "There's nothing to fear." He held himself well in check, but I could see how he longed to take her in his strong, safe arms and kiss her fears away. It was pitiful to see them standing there together, their love for each other so evident to us all. To Kenneth it would have been wormwood and gall. Ralph fetched her a chair from his room, and we showed her what I had found. Margaret was the last to be roused, and we had to knock on her door repeatedly before we could wake her up, and then she was some minutes again before she joined us. Her eyes, too, seemed heavy with sleep, but in contrast to Ethel, she stood alert and awake. A pink dressing gown, opened wide at her full white throat, showed the creamy texture of her curving breast. She put up a hand to the pretty gap, as with a giggle she said, "What a sight I must look." However unsuitable the occasion, I thought, she must always have her femininity on parade. We none of us made the sought-for reply, and she went and knelt by Ethel's chair, holding and patting her hands. While we were waiting for Margaret, the doctor had gone upstairs again to find out about Annie and cook. Annie evidently was already wakened by the noise we had made, and I soon heard him talking to her. Cook, however, he could not rouse, though we heard him pounding and banging away on her door. There was something altogether ghastly in the noise he made while we waited whispering below. Thud, 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 and then a pause, and before the echoes had died away, a fierce thud, thud again. Thud, thud, thud. Death, for surely the dead and only the dead could sleep through such a thudding. He rejoined us, placid and unconcerned. I can't wake her, but I am sure that I can hear her breathing, he told us. If she has been drinking, though, it might take more than mere noise to rouse her. She has locked her door, and left the key in it turned so that I can't push it out. He was the only one of us I noticed to speak above a whisper and in his usual voice. But what on earth is it all about? Kenneth asked. You were pretty sarcastic, I remember, this afternoon, when I suggested waking Ethel. He overpitched his voice in an attempt to copy the doctor's equanimity. Poor Kenneth. Yes, but then you see, I knew that she was safe, and this little Satan's love note had not been found. I don't understand it. What were you both doing about the house at this time of night? Kenneth asked, turning to me. If you found it, why did you wake up the doctor, of all people, before the rest of us? I looked at the Tundish. Not a word had I said as to where I had found him, and I wondered what he would tell them, but he never hesitated for a fraction of a second. Oh, I imagine that Jeff Cock would have told you all there is to tell while I have been upstairs, he replied. And then he proceeded to tell them everything. How I had sat up late and going to the garden for a stroll had seen a light shine from the landing window. How I had found the notice behind the switch and him with his flashlight searching the floor of Stella's room. The only thing he omitted to mention was a door we both heard shut with a click on the landing below. When he had finished, he turned to me to corroborate his statement. I could not understand him. Why should he confess so readily to being abroad at night, in circumstances so suspicious, and then ignore the one salient point that stood out so clearly in his favor? I nodded my assent. It was his business after all, and I would not interfere. His explanation was received in silence, a silence tense with incredulity and disbelief. Ralph asked him what he was doing in Stella's room, and he gave the same explanation that he had given to me a little time before. His voice held not a trace of emotion or concern. We were all of us looking at him, Ethel with friendly trust and approval, the two boys and Margaret with suspicions they either could not or did not bother to conceal. For myself, I hardly knew what to think. He faced us all unmoved. He smiled reassuringly at Ethel. Either of you two then could have put this up behind the switch? Kenneth asked. You could have put it there quite as easily yourself, I answered him angrily. He shrugged his shoulders. It just happens that I didn't, he said very stiffly. The man was insufferable, a fool. We might any of us say that, Ethel joined, up in arms at once directly the Tundish was attacked. Besides, she added, if either Francis or the Tundish had done it, wouldn't they have printed this one like they did the last? No, of course they wouldn't. It would have given them away at once. I, or any of the rest of us, might have tried to copy the doctor's printing, just as you did last night, Jeff Cock, but either of you two would obviously have to adopt, well, something like this, he finished rather lamely, pointing to the card. The Tundish looked amused. All very pretty up to a point, Kenneth, but don't you see that what you say applies quite equally to all of us? It was an easy matter for Jeff Cock to copy my printing in the first place, and he did it well enough for the purpose. But you don't really suppose for one moment that his attempt would have hoodwinked an expert? If this means anything at all, the author would never dare to write it out by hand. No, you may be certain of this, that whoever put this card where Jeff Cock says he found it, put the poison into Stella's glass and killed her. And in my opinion, once again, the opportunity has been equally open to us all. No one will admit having done it. We all, including the doctor, deny having had anything to do with it, I suppose? Kenneth queried. The Tundish thanked him for the special mention, and we each denied it in turn. Ethel sat limp in a chair, Margaret kneeling beside her. We four men stood round them, the dim light overhead casting a distorted shadows across the floor and up the landing wall. The Tundish, unruffled and pleasant, his hands in his dressing-gown pockets, rocking himself gently backward and forward on heel and toe. The boys glum and dour, myself nearly dead with fatigue. A long silence closed down on us again. Liar, murderer, poisoner, went whispering through the silence. 6 denials, and one of them a lie. Who of the 6 was lying? The doctor, as ever, broke the pause. Well, we can do no more now, and in the morning we must tell the police of this new development. You two girls, hop back to bed while we make sure about the cook. Hush it up as long as we can. All go to bed, good friends. I'll take damned good care that the police know all about it in the morning. But before I go to bed, I should like to know where the paper is from which the words have been cut. You won't object to our searching your room?" It was Kenneth, of course, who spoke, and Ralph nodded his agreement. "We ought to search all the rooms," he said. Almost beyond hearing any more, I burst out with, "For God's sake, do let us go to bed and leave Alpo to do his own dirty work." I spoke querulously and with more feeling than I really intended. My voice was out of control. I felt the others looking at me in surprise. The Tundish hesitated. "Well, it's just a chance, but I don't think we gain very much if the paper is found. I know that if I were guilty, it wouldn't be in my room that anyone would find it." They were persistent, however, and while Ethel was too tired to take any interest, Margaret seemed inclined to agree with the boys. The doctor assented good-naturedly, and I gave away with the best grace I could. We dealt first with the rooms belonging to the girls, so that they could complete their broken rest. Kenneth proposed that they might be allowed to deal with each other's, but the doctor would have none of it. Moreover, he insisted on all keeping together as the rooms were searched in turn. "One of us is a liar, and worse than a liar, and not to be trusted alone." We unmade the beds. We pulled up all the carpets and turned out all the drawers, scattering the clothing on the floor. Nothing was neglected, saving modesty, and nothing incriminating found. Ethel went back to bed. We heard the key turn in the door of her room, and then we moved across the landing into mine. I stood in the doorway, watching the others at work, with Margaret, who said she was sure she would never get to sleep again, at my side. "Isn't it all too fearfully thrilling?" she whispered confidentially, clutching a dressing gown together with exaggerated modesty. I could cheerfully have slain her on the spot. Before a bare couple of minutes had passed, Kenneth, who was emptying my few belongings out of the chest of drawers, held up a news sheet above his head in triumph. "I knew we should find it. I knew I was right," he cried triumphantly. "What have you all of you to say to that?" He might have spotted a Derby winner. We crowded round him. He held the paper up to the light, and we could see at once where here and there odd words and letters had been cut away. That this was the paper that had been used, there could be no shadow of a doubt. They turned to me with questioning glances. Margaret whispered inaudible, "Oh, you!" I had nothing to say, no explanation to give, and stood stupidly tongue-tied before them all. I was too astounded to speak or protest, but I remembered that the doctor had been awake and abroad in the quiet house while I was downstairs, and the rest were locked in their rooms and asleep. His and mine were the only two unoccupied. To make up the notice, place it over the switch, and then step into my room and deposit the paper where it had been found. What, I thought, could have been easier for him to do than that? Had he not just stated that if he were guilty, that was what he would do? But afterward, would he have gone upstairs to Stella's room and have allowed me to find him there? Or was his search and his private detective work all a pretense, and was he really on some murderous errand which I had interrupted? I knows what I knows. Cook had said. Besotted, drunken cook. What did she know? I wondered. Was she really upstairs snoring? Or had she too, like Stella, made a last adventure and opened the door at the end of the passage? These were the thoughts that flashed across my mind as I stood stupidly turning the paper this way and that. When I did look up, I found Margaret gazing at me with ill-concealed horror. The Tundish, half amused and wholly sympathetic. Kenneth was making a further search, and he soon produced another card like the one that had been completed, a tube of paste, and then a pair of scissors. The paste came from the doctor's desk. The scissors Margaret claimed as hers. They were the ones she had missed when she cleared up her work to go to bed, and she did not fail to remind me how we had looked for them together. "Well, it certainly smells a bit fishy." "And did you smell fish when the key was found under your own pillow, Kenneth?" the Tundish asked him quietly. "Yes, I did. And as you have asked me the question, I believe it was the same piece of fish." "Meaning?" "Why, you damned liar, of course." The doctor laughed. "You'll win yet, Kenneth, for you'll certainly be the death of me. Anyhow, you take charge of the treasure trove. Margaret, off to bed with you. We can do no more here now." He was in command of the situation once more, and to me, at least, it seemed quite natural that he should be. Kenneth insisted, however, that we should go upstairs and verify the doctor's statement that Cook's snores could be heard through the door, and though I could hear her distinctly and could confirm his opinion, Kenneth pretended that he was not sure and Ralph, of course, followed Kenneth's lead and was not certain either. The Tundish was willing to convince them, and fetched a stout screwdriver with which, after some little delay, the lock of the door was pried open. She was lying fully dressed on the top of a bed, her head rolling about grotesquely in time with a heavy breathing. The windows were tight shut, and the room reeked of spirits. The doctor, steadying her head with one hand, raised an eyelid with the other. She never stirred. "Dead drunk, but not dead," he pronounced. He opened the window, and we filed away downstairs. The boys disappeared to their rooms. The Tundish and I were alone. "It's uncanny the way the evidence against me grows," he said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Against you? Surely I am the more implicated over this?" He smiled broadly. "No, indeed. All the other doors, except yours and mine, were locked. You would never have left such a clue at large and unprotected. It would have been your first care and concern. On the other hand, how exactly it fits with what I might have done myself. You must believe me, though, when I assure you that I did not." I believed him. Ridiculous as it may sound, I believed him implicitly, and I told him so. We stood alone on the dimly lighted landing. The great cathedral clock was chiming 2. We could hear Kenneth barricading his door. "And you believe in me?" I asked. He nodded. "Have you any suspicions at all? Why should anyone go to such trouble over such a mad joke?" "Mad?" "Yes, but diabolically clever too. Don't you realize how it has emphasized last night's notice and helped to link it all up with Stella's murder?" "Yes, but mine was a vital part of that. It meant nothing, surely, until I printed my asinine edition." "Surely it did. Think how I called attention to the fact that each of us might have been alone upstairs last night. Think how odd and out of keeping the whole silly practical joke must appear to Alport. Why, you thought so yourself. You know you did. And now the second notice. Me caught prowling about the house at night, and the newspaper found in the only vacant bedroom. Whether any further crime was intended tonight or not, nothing could have told more heavily against me. Remember, too, how at Alport's inquiry Kenneth stressed—" His sentence trailed away to nothing, and he stood gazing into vacant space, a puzzled frown on his clear-cut, pleasant face. "Well, off you go to bed," he said, breaking through his reverie. "I may yet get my call to that young citizen's reveille." I staggered to my room and tumbled out of my clothes and into bed. My brain refused to tackle further problems, but my last conscious thoughts were of Kenneth. Could I imagine him guilty? Kenneth, a murderer? Yes. Just possible, perhaps. But Kenneth diabolically clever? No. Most emphatically, no. The end of chapter 11.